Today I'm going to be disassembling this Minolta Rokkor-PF 55mm f1.7 lens. This is one of the early style MC rockers with the metal focus ring. And this particular lens is in fairly good condition, but it has a few issues. The aperture blades seem to have a bit of oxidation, but they're still fairly responsive. And there are a few little scuffs and things on the front element and the back element as well. But the body itself appears to be in fairly good condition. So what I'm going to do is fully disassemble this lens in order to reach the aperture blades and clean those, and then also remove all the body elements so I can clean those individually and get it nice and looking new again. So to start with, I'm going to have to go in from the front of the lens to actually reach the aperture blades. So I'm going to start by removing this front ID plate. And the way it's attached is it just screws in, but there are two little divots that you can use to unscrew it, and they're right here and here. And I'm going to use a spanning wrench, which I bought from SK Grimes. It's just a convenient tool that slots into the divots, and you can use it to actually unscrew the ID plate. But if you don't have one of those, you can also cut out a little piece of foam or something like that and place it on top of the ID plate and use some sort of circular thing with that won't press up against the center of the lens and press against the sides and actually unscrew the ID plate that way. So now that I have the ID plate loosened up, I can just unscrew the rest of it. Okay, so with the ID plate removed, if I need to reach the aperture blades directly, I can just remove the front element. And again, this front element here has two little divots where I can use the spanning wrench to unscrew the front element from the rest of the lens body. And I'm removing this so I can reach the aperture blades directly. And if you don't actually need to fully clean them, you don't need to take them out, and you just need to put a drop of alcohol or something on them, then you can actually, once you have the aperture blades out or exposed, you can actually just clean them directly here. But in my case, I'm going to actually have to fully remove them to try to clean the undersides as well. But now we can see that the aperture blades are fully exposed. You can see them moving back and forth when I move the aperture ring. So because I have to fully remove these blades to try to clean them and try to get the underside of them as well, where it looks like there's more buildup of stuff, I'm going to have to remove more elements. So next I'm going to remove this circular ring here, that metal ring that moves when the lens focuses in and out. And there are just 3 screws that are holding it in place. Okay, and now I can actually remove the lens element and the lens main body completely from the rest of the lens body. So this whole section here is what actually holds the lens elements and the aperture blades. So I'm going to have to remove these 4 screws around here to fully remove the aperture blades and get those exposed on their own. So with those removed, I can just remove the entire main lens assembly. And now I have the back lens element here with the aperture exposed and separate from the main lens body. So I'm going to start by actually cleaning off the aperture blades and try to see if I can get them to be a little better looking, maybe a little bit more responsive. So to isolate those on their own, I'm going to remove the back lens element. It just screws in here, and if it's in and you can't remove it easily. There are two little divots you can use a spanning wrench on as well, but you can just unscrew it by hand usually. Now I have access to both the front and the backs of the aperture blades. I can see that there's a lot of little grease or something build up here. It might be slowing them down a little bit. They're definitely a little bit oxidized. They're a little bit of a reddish color. So I'm going to try to clean those off. In a lot of cases you can actually just leave the aperture blades in place and clean both sides of them with a Q-tip. You want to be careful not to press too hard since they are very thin, but I'm going to actually remove them fully from the lens assembly and clean them individually in a bath of isopropyl alcohol. So in order to remove the aperture blades, they're held in place by these 3 set screws around the edge of this assembly here, and those are holding this ring in place, which is what's holding the blades in place. Once you actually undo these screws, then there's nothing holding the blades in place, and if you don't actually want to disassemble the aperture and have to put it back together again, then you shouldn't remove these fully. So I'm just going to undo these most of the way, not all the way because it's kind of a pain to put them back in place once you take them apart. Okay, so I removed this metal retaining ring thing, and now we can see that when I rotate this black metal ring here, it moves the aperture back and forth. If I hold it in place and move the lever, it also moves the aperture. Okay, so with the aperture blades exposed and loose, I'm going to just remove all of them individually. I'm just going to remove this little spring here, and now the entire mechanism should just slide out fairly easily. Okay. So now you can see the individual pieces of the aperture assembly here. Have blades all out, and you can clean them individually. Here I've placed the aperture blades in a bath of isopropyl alcohol, and I'm just going to clean them each individually with some Q-tips to try to remove some of those grimy spots that we saw before. And you want to use some sort of container with a fairly flat bottom so you're not bending the blades too much. You also don't want to apply too much pressure on the side over here, since there are 2 little pegs that can be removed. And you also want to avoid bending the blades when you're turning them. Okay, so now I clean the individual blades. I'm just going to set them aside to dry. You don't want to handle them with your skin or fingers at this point, just because then you'll get oil on them again and you'll have to clean them off again. So just using little tweezers, set them aside to dry out. At this point I can begin to disassemble the rest of the lens to remove all these exterior elements in order to clean them. So I want to remove this ring here, this one, and this focus ring here, so that I can clean them individually without affecting any of these interior metal components that I probably don't want to get wet or use a cleaning solution on. So to start, I'm going to remove the focus ring, which is this element here. I'm just going around, and it's just held in place by 3 screws around there. If you don't need to remove the focus ring, you probably shouldn't, because once you do, you have to re-zero the lens so that it focuses correctly to infinity. But in my case, since I want to clean out the focus ring, I'm going to remove these screws and do that later so that it focuses correctly. Okay, so now I can just remove the focus ring, set that aside for cleaning. Now the whole focusing assembly is visible, and I want to remove these other two elements down here. So I'm going to go in from the back of the lens this time. I'm going to remove this silver ring here. There are 3 screws again holding it in place. So I can just lift off that silver ring that goes on the back of the lens, set that aside. Next, I'm going to remove the aperture control ring, this metal ring going around here, so I can clean that individually as well. And to get to that, I'm going to remove the main lens body and the actual focusing element so I'm going to remove this focusing mechanism here from the lens body. It's just held in place with these 4 screws right there. So now I can lift off this back mounting plate, set that aside, and now I can actually remove the aperture control ring. The one thing is that there's a really tiny ball bearing that's actually what provides the clicking sound right in here. So when you remove this, you want to be careful you don't lose that ball bearing. It rests, there's a little tiny indentation right there where it rests. So I'm going to set that aside. Okay, so now I have the aperture control ring on its own, and I just need to remove one last thing, which is this focusing mechanism from this one last body piece that has the depth numbers on them. And it's just held in place again with 4 screws right here, which I'll remove. Okay, so now you can see I have the focusing mechanism and the last body piece separated. So now you can actually clean each of these individual body pieces in soapy water or some sort of cleaning solution to get out all that grime and other stuff without worrying about damaging the focusing mechanism or other pieces. You can also remove these individual little metal pieces that are attached here and here, but I generally haven't done that because it's not necessary if you dry out the pieces quickly if you're using water or another cleaning solution. I haven't seen any that actually damage them. Now we can start putting the lens back together after cleaning off all the elements we want to get clean. So it's just the reverse order of what we did before. I'm going to start with attaching the focusing mechanism back to the body here, and there's a little peg thing here that has to go into this groove here, and that should just slide in fairly easily. And there are 4 screw holes around here that need to be lined up with the 4 there. We can just reattach that. Okay, so now the focusing mechanism is reattached. You can see when we rotate it moves up and down again correctly. So now I can reattach this aperture control ring. And that one just slides into place, but you need to remember that there's that really tiny ball bearing. I just dropped, and there it is. That needs to go in place, or else the aperture won't click and stop correctly. So the ball bearing goes in this little tiny indentation right there. It should just kind of sit in there once you can get it there. And then the aperture control ring, you have to align these grooves here with the ball bearing and just slide it into place. Okay, and now when we rotate it, it should be making that clicking sound, which it is, and it should also be going between the maximum aperture and the minimum, which or the maximum and the minimum, which it is as well. So it seems to be correct there. And now to actually lock that in place, we can reattach this back mounting plate. So to realign the back mounting plate, the things you want to line up correctly, there are these 4 screws that have to be going here, 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 and here. And you want to have this lever so that it's opposite of where this depth scale is over there. So the way it lines up is like this. And then just reattach it with those 4 screws there. Okay, now that's all set. You can reattach this silver ring again. It just has those 3 screws that we took out. Now that is pretty much complete, and we can move on to rebuilding the aperture with the blades all dried out now. So rebuilding the aperture is the most tedious part here. Just because the aperture blades are so small and they have to be lined up correctly. So I'm going to start by replacing this back metal ring into here. Just lined as these 2 pegs that should go, one through here and the other one, there we go. And I can reattach this spring that I removed earlier to remove that element. I can reattach it around this little post. Okay, that's that. Now that's kind of locked in place. Okay, so now I'm actually going to rebuild the aperture. And the way this has to work is that there are 6 little pegs on this metal ring going around, and each of the aperture blades itself has a little slot and then another little peg here towards the center. And this peg towards the center has to be sticking up, and these slots have to go on the pegs down there. So to start with, I'm going to use tweezers or something to avoid handling the blades and getting oil on them. And I'm going to just position one of them on one of the pegs as best as I can. Okay. Now for the next one, just lie it on top of that first one I put down. So it just goes overlapping. Just like that. And as I'm going around, I'm just going to keep these edges here roughly aligned with that circle. Same for the next. And for the fourth as well. Okay, so for the last two, I actually have to start weaving them in and out. So I'm going to position this fifth blade just normally first. Get it on the peg there. Now I have to thread the tip of the fifth one under the first one. So just very gently. So holding it in place over there, I'm going to try to get that under there. And I'm going to do the same thing for this last one as well. I'm just going to, but I have to thread it under the first one and the second one and on top of the fifth one that I laid down. So to start, I'm just going to position it on the peg where it needs to go. Not worry about threading them correctly yet. Now I'm going to hold it down over here so it stays in the correct position and attempt to get it under this first one that I put down without bending it too much. So with all the blades in place and correctly overlapping, I have to get this ring back threaded with each of these pegs in the center going through these holes. So I'm going to start by just realigning all the blades in the slot so that they're as far inwards as possible, and also going around this edge in a rough circle. Okay, now I'm going to try to slide this down and position it on top of the blades. Oops. Okay, so now it's there and I have to align it with all the individual pegs now, which is the interesting part. So I got that one lined up over there, and just nudge by pushing on the edges of the blades or the little pegs here. You should get that lined up as well. Okay, got that one. Got that one. Just holding it in place once I get them so I don't lose the position. Okay, so now that's in place, it looks like everything's all set up correctly. I'm gonna just initially tighten it down. Just gonna put this metal retaining ring back on. There's two sides of it. I want the more sloped side facing up so that the set screws can actually go into it. And I'm going to tighten these set screws again, or replace them if I lost them. What we want to look for is that the blades are overlapping correctly, which they seem to be. And both the front and the back have the same pattern we had before. And now I actually have to adjust the aperture itself. You can see when it's fully open right now, there's still this little edge visible, and when it's fully closed, there's almost nothing getting through. So I'm going to loosen up all these set screws just a tiny bit so I can slide the aperture around, and when I tighten it back down, I'll be in the correct position. So I want to have it so that when the lens is fully open, the aperture blades are just barely visible, or barely off the edge here, and when it's fully closed, it should have a small but still reasonably sized hole for light to get through. And I'm going to try that, so I'll just tighten that down and then move this back and forth, see what that looks like. That's a bit too small, so retry. Okay, so that, when I move it back and forth, now you can see it's fully open. There's no blades visible. When it's fully closed, there's still this tiny but reasonably sized hole. So now I'll just finish tightening down the rest of these set screws. And check everything's moving correctly again. Oops, there we go. It's very smooth, a little bit smoother than before. So now that's all set up. At this point you can also clean the front and back element interior. I generally just use a air blower or something to actually dust them out, but you can actually use a Q-tip or something with cleaning solution on them to clean them. So now I'm going to actually replace this main lens mechanism into the camera or the lens body. And to do that, there are two things I have to line up. There's this little fork thing that has to get lined up with the aperture control ring. It has this little tiny knob thing there that I have to line up so that when it moves back and forth it slides with this. Then I also have to line this peg up over here with this thing down here, so when I move that back and forth it also controls the aperture. So I'm going to start by trying to line this up. I'm going to set this all the way open and turn this so it's at fully open as well on the aperture ring. And I'm going to try to line the fork over here up with where it needs to go in here as best as I can. Okay, so there we go. Now I can just reattach this to start with, just in these four . Once I have it reasonably secured, I can make sure that the aperture responds correctly when I move the control ring, and that when I move this lever down here, it also responds correctly. So it looks good. I can finish attaching the body to the main lens element. Okay, so now I can replace the focusing ring. Want to have it so that it goes from 0 to infinity. There are two little, or a prong here that has to go in. It should click when it reaches 0 and the minimum focusing distance and infinity. And I'll just temporarily attach these back in with these 3 screws here that have the little washers as well. Okay, so right now I just kind of arbitrarily attach these, but to actually correctly line these back up with infinity focus, I actually want to go outside, loosen these up a bit, and move this into the focusing mechanism around separately from the focusing ring here, so that when it moves, so that when it's set to infinity, the lens is actually at infinity as well. And that's just something you can do visually. So find some distant object and focus on that, and make sure that this is all the way over and it stops at infinity. But for now, I'll just close that back up. Okay, now I can reattach the front lens element. It just screws back in. Okay, and that's locked in place. Can replace this protection thing just with those 3 screws there. Okay, so now when I rotate, it's correctly going in and out. Fairly smooth. Now I can just put on the ID plate and finish up. And use the spanning wrench to reattach that securely. So now seems to be working correctly when it's set fully open. Aperture blades are not showing. When it's closed, there's tiny aperture still. And the focusing nice and smooth. And it just needs to be zeroed so that I can correctly focus to infinity once again.